All right, well, it's 7 o'clock, so we could get started. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Briget Ganske, a youth media producer with Student Reporting Labs. And this is our second audio storytelling webinar. The first one, actually, we could go back a slide. Yeah, here. Our first audio storytelling webinar happened about a month ago, and our guests, and that one included Vika Aronson, NewsHour podcast producer, and Justin Rhodes, who's a producer at Wellbeings. We talked about how to find characters for your story, how to focus your story. Vika showed us how she organizes and plans all of her podcast episodes. We looked at sort of different ways audio stories sound these days to get inspiration, and students also asked questions and talked about their stories. So it was a really great introduction to audio storytelling. If you haven't seen it, if you weren't there live, it is on our YouTube, which we can chat in the link. Oh, Marcus just did. Thanks, Marcus. Another thing to point out, this just came out today, but we at Student Reporting Labs is looking for a student host for our podcast, and there's an application. Thanks to Marcus, he just posted that link. So as a student host for our podcast, we're looking for someone who can sort of introduce our episodes, do some interviews with student producers and mental health experts, give the show credits, sort of be kind of like the voice of our first Student Reporting Labs podcast. So super exciting opportunity. We even have some money, so it's kind of like a paid internship. So if you are here today, and which probably means you're interested in audio storytelling, I encourage you to apply. And if you're a teacher, share that opportunity with your students. So next slide. Tonight, we are talking more about audio storytelling, specifically how to get some tools for structuring and editing your stories to make it sound as best as it can, and to come away energized, inspired, and confident to edit your own stories. So we're kind of gearing this towards students who are making stories, audio stories for our mental health podcast assignment. But if you're a student who is not doing that assignment, or if you're a teacher and just want to learn, like, welcome. This will be helpful and useful for you too. So those are kind of the goals for tonight. With us tonight, Cheryl Aguilar, who was with us in the previous webinar. She's a therapist and director of the name of the place was hidden, but Hope Center, right? Yeah, Hope Center for Wellness. And it's so great to have a mental health expert present for these kind of talks, since that's the topic that we're telling stories about, and to have someone who's sort of on call to help answer any questions during the question and answer part from students about their stories, and just to kind of be support for us. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always so delighted to be with students. I love young people, and I love that you're telling stories. As a therapist, I know that the stories that you tell help people feel connected and feel hope. And the more you tell stories, the more we shatter stigma that help people find services like ours. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your questions and what you're doing.
Thanks, Cheryl. And then our other guest tonight is Steph Colbourn. She's a podcast producer and president of Editaudio, and from Montreal, as we were just talking about. So I was going to ask everyone in the chat, kind of as an icebreaker. I don't know if that's been chatted yet, but we were talking about how interesting it is to find out from you all, if you could interview anyone, dead or alive, for your podcast, who would you want to interview? So if you can chat that at any time during this.
Such a good question.
But Steph, start us out. Like, how did you get into podcast, into audio storytelling? Tell us a bit about your journey, how you fell in love, when that relationship with audio storytelling began.
Yeah, I actually have a music background. And then I got sort of into the sound aspect of things first. So I got into music. I got into like music production. And coincidentally, at the same time, I was doing a creative writing degree in script writing. And at the time, I wasn't really aware of podcasts. It wasn't something that like, I didn't, I wasn't born like, I'm going to be a podcast producer. But now looking back on it, I'm like, oh, obviously I had this like audio engineering production background and also this script writing education, and those kind of fall perfectly into podcasting. So after school, I was doing arts and I ended up needing a job to pay bills. And so I worked in media for a bit, doing a bunch of podcast and video production. And then I started and ventured out on my own, creating my own company.
Awesome. And I think we even have some pictures of your company on a next slide or so. Or here, do you want to talk, maybe first, do you want to talk about why you love specifically audio stories? What about them you're particularly drawn to as a medium?
Also, please let me know in the chat if you appreciate my amazing gifts that I've added tonight. Yeah, I think I love a lot of things about podcasting. These are like the three I think that drew me the most in and continue to draw me the most in. Like the intimacy of podcasts is kind of like not like any other media, right? In TV or film or even when you read a book, there's all these other people in the room when you're recording and producing something, and there's all these other people's opinions coming in, and then it's edited and blah, blah, blah. And in podcasting, it really does feel like an intimate conversation often with like one person and the listener. And I think that's like a really beautiful, cool thing. Even when it is edited and there's like other people contributing, it really does feel more intimate to me than something that you're watching on TV. And often when we're listening in really like intimate places, like during our commute or exercising or while we're doing the dishes. And so it feels like these people are with us in our like daily routine and our daily lives, which I think sort of establishes that intimate relationship too. And then, yeah, community. I think often most podcasts I listen to, at least, the host always says like, if you have a question about this, reach out, here's my direct email, or like, I actually know Sangeeta Pillai, who won the Spotify incubator program, I think in 2020. Like she ended up making this podcast about like women in India, and it ended up building this actual like tangible community online of like women gathering together. So I think there's like really tangible ways that it's created communities, but also in general, I think you have this line of access to the host that, like you don't know how to get in touch with like someone you see on TV. And then diversity is something that like I really focus on with my company. I think because podcasting is a pretty new medium and the like entry into it is like pretty affordable and accessible, it has created a more diverse landscape than more traditional forms of media. So I think not only is there diversity in the people that are creating the content, but in the types of stories that you're hearing and the types of topics that you're hearing. Like you can basically search your most like niche interest, and I'm sure there's a podcast or 10 on it, that are, one of them has to be good.
Yeah, tell us more about your company and kind of the work that you do.
Yeah, this is my beautiful team right now. And so our company's Editaudio. We basically we're a mission-driven company, so that the mission to get more diversity in the content we're producing is top of mind, but it's also a mission to get more diverse people in the studios that we're creating. So in production, into recording, into engineering. So our team is made up of fully women, trans, and non-binary people, and the contractors we work with are too. And that's really important to us. And mental health is important too. I mean, I think that it's really cool that, y'all are making these stories, these podcasts about your mental health. And I think the reason it ties into this diversity thing, like the reason we want a more diverse production studio is because if we're telling stories about, certain communities or certain groups of people, we want to be able to have those voices in the room when we're producing those stories so that we can represent them well. And with mental health, I think that's super important. Like if you're writing or creating content about mental health, you don't want to feed into the like stigmas or misrepresentation of those mental health disorders already. So you want to be mindful of that, and also have people in the room when you're creating the content to make sure that, you know, they've had these experiences and they know how to like frame those properly. And I myself have OCD, so if anyone else has OCD and wants to talk about it, shoot me a line.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I see some great photos of people that you've gotten to work with. Tell us about some of these stories.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is just an added bonus of working in this industry, is you get to work with lots of cool people. I didn't know who to choose for this slide, so I picked an array of people, but the person in the top left with the brown sweaters, Zach Cornfield, he's one of the members of the Try Guys, which is like a YouTube quad of people that does fun things on the internet. Jane Fonda is in the suit below, who I think people probably know, but is like my icon. So that was like a huge, I mean, you can see how red my face is in that photo. I was very excited to meet her. And then with the blue eyeshadow is Tess Holliday. She's a model, and I think she was the first plus size model to walk a runway in Fashion Week. And then below that is Saweetie, who's a rapper, artist. She has that like viral TikTok, well now it's a TikTok challenge. That song is like tap, tap, tap in. I'm embarrassed that there's going to be a video of me singing that on the internet, but all were very cool.
Well, Student Reporting Labs we didn't just join TikTok, but we're really like amping up our TikTok. So that's exciting for us. Great. So a lot of our students who are doing the mental health podcast assignment that we have, a lot of them have done their interview and have either made a rough cut or are making it or are revising. So tell us some tips you have for sort of after the interview, tips for post-production. I threw in this cartoon from the New Yorker. The woman, I think it's the woman who's saying this, I assume she's talking to her husband, saying, can you put on the cooking podcast? It's more narrative driven than the workday podcast, but a little more structured than the walking podcast, and is a more compelling host than the shower podcast. So I just love that so much. And I mean, I know that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a podcast that's all of those things: narrative driven, structured in like the best way possible, like compelling host. What tips do you have for like just making the best podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different kinds of podcasts, so that's the first place to start. But I have a few like rules of thumb that I think can go for every type of content. So my first tip here is that I try to surprise the listener every 2 minutes. Because we have shortest attention span. So I think actually less than 2 minutes is ideal, but at least every 2 minutes you want to have some sort of surprise in there. And I know that a lot of the students are producing shorter pieces, like 5 to 10 minute pieces. So in those, I would say you're even opened up more to like having little surprises in there, because you know, the piece is shorter, so you can kind of do more with it. Where with a longer piece, you want to have more airy bits, right, where things sort of breathe. So if it's 20 minutes or over, I think 2 minutes is like the bare minimum to surprise people. And a surprise can be anything. So I'll get to what surprises could be. But this was more on like structuring a podcast. So I think you had mentioned in past episodes, you talked about, you know, choosing who you want to speak to and what sort of content you want to address. This is, you know, once you've decided that like who you want to talk to. So for example, if I was doing a podcast on OCD, you know, I might want to talk to 4 other people that have OCD. I might want to talk to a psychologist. I might want to talk to someone who's doing research in the field, and maybe I want to talk to, you know, a comedian who does comedy about mental health, right? But once you have all that tape, you have so much to work with, and what do you do with it? So what we like to do is pick out the clips that we remember as memorable from the interview. So what we do is we take all of that recorded tape, we transcribe all of it, so that we have pieces of text to work with. And then once we have those text pieces, we sort of select the clips that we think are the best. So anything that we remember from the interview, or we'll listen through one more time, and anything that stands out as like, oh, this is really interesting, or we love this bit, we'll highlight it and move it onto another working document. And then once you have all of those, chunks, those paragraphs in this working document, you get to script the pieces around them. So I have this like image here on the side, which is the very beginning of a podcast that isn't out yet, so not super useful because you can't listen to it. But there's a cold open. We like to start the podcast with a cold open. So here's 2 potential clips there that could be the cold open, could be cut down into the cold open, and then intro voiceover. This would be the scripted part that we're tying in after those cold opens.
Can you explain a cold open, what that is?
Yeah, a cold open is like instead of introducing the podcast like, hey, I'm Steph, and today I'm going to be talking to you about dogs. This is the dog podcast. Instead of starting with that, you start with like a attention grabbing clip. So if in your interview, someone has this really good one-liner or a really funny clip, you'll want to use that in the beginning. And I also like to use it as a way to like set tone for the show. So if the podcast is going to be, funny, I'll get a really funny clip and put that as the cold open. And it just sort of like keeps people, it's in the back of people's mind as you're going through that intro, like prologue about what people are listening to.
Got it. Okay. So it's kind of like a little teaser, like, hey, this.
Yeah, it's like a teaser. And I actually think you can reuse it later, you know, and have people sort of like remember back to the beginning, which is fun.
Awesome.
And in the same vein, I also like to let people know what they're listening to and why they should care. I think often when we get into producing, we forget this because we're so used to all this other content that we absorb with like reading or watching TV or watching movies where we have other information to go off of, right? If you have visuals, you don't need something repeated to you often because you're getting it in the visual and you're getting it in the sound. But with podcasts, like you're absorbing all of the information while you're listening to it, and oftentimes you're doing other things. So I like to always set up a clip that I'm about to introduce and then also remind people why they, like, what was the important part from that clip. So a good example would be in a crime podcast that we're working on right now. There are 2 people that went missing, and we're talking about the events from the day before they went missing. So they went to the grocery store, they went to the bar, they went to their friend's house, then they went back home, they took a nap, then they went to the park, and, all these things. And there's all these timelines that are working out. And then, if you heard that for the first time, you come away being like, wait, what? Like, I don't remember any of that. So after that clip is played, we like to then take a second and say, okay, just to recap, this is the important thing. Like at 2:52 p.m., they weren't at home. And then the person's like, oh, okay, I get an understanding of it. So setting up the clip that you're going to play and then reminding the listener why they listened to that clip and what was the takeaway from it is important. And I think in the same way, setting up the entire podcast episode in the intro and telling people what they're listening to and why it's important is important as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. So for students' stories, like they could write that sort of voiceover or voice track, kind of like repeating some of the takeaways that they've gotten from their interview, or important lessons that their subject is saying in their interview or something.
And sometimes it doesn't even have to be that blatant. Like sometimes you can just repeat what the person said. So if you were interviewing, let's say I was interviewing someone for this theoretical OCD podcast, and the psychologist said, X amount of people in the United States have OCD. And that was the takeaway. And then there was a line after that. I would say, oh, I didn't know that fact, but it was nice to hear that X amount of other people in the United States have OCD, and then carry on. So you don't have to say, hey, this is the important thing. You just have to kind of like remind people of the thing that is the takeaway.
Okay.
Does that
really
make sense?
Tip to make it like sound natural. So it's not just this like,
I mean, or you could be cute with it and be like, important fact, and like a little sound effect and put it in. Be creative, do what you want. So this is also another tip that I like to use, and this is like industry wide. People always say the first 3 minutes of your podcast are all that matters. So even if the podcast is like an hour long, if the first 3 minutes are boring, people are going to turn it off. So you want to captivate and draw in the listener within the first 3 minutes as best as you can. And a good way to do that is, like we were talking about in the beginning, the cold open. So having that like grab quote, especially if you have like, you know, a celebrity on your show or something really important that you're talking about, if you can have that at the beginning that people can hold on to while they're going through, like, you know, the intro and understanding of things, like the setup, I think that is really important. Something else that you can do is layer music, which will go to the next slide.
Nice.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways that you can use music in a podcast. I think these are the three that I usually talk about. So a music bed is something that exists underneath narration or voiceover or a clip from an interview that you're doing with someone. And it's sort of used as a way to heighten the mood that you're trying to create. So, you know, if someone's saying something sad, you want to have more somber music. If someone's saying something funny, you might want to have more upbeat music. And you can sort of use this as a way to surprise the listener too. So if someone has a 5-minute speech that they're going on, most of us are going to get bored by the 5th minute, right? We're not listening. If someone speaks at you for 5 minutes, it gets boring. So in the middle of that, you might want to add some music and change up the pacing so that then people are just like more likely to follow through. Sound effects are, well, I think we all know what a sound effect is, but it's you could use it to, you know, if you're going to a shipping container yard, you could have like metal sounds and maybe water sounds, or if you're being tongue in cheek with something, you know, you could have that little ba-ding, here's more information about that. And then theme music is if you end up making your show into something more serialized or you have multiple episodes, sometimes it's nice to have like a branded sound that you use throughout them. So that would be theme music. So this is an example I wanted to know. So we're doing a crime podcast right now. And in the first clip, which we'll play in a second, there is a piece of narration that the host is talking to one of the moms of the person that went missing. And the first one has no music in it. And I want you guys to listen to it and let me know what kind of music or sound effects that you would put into this piece to make it more exciting.
Stacy and Susie had known each other as kids, but had grown apart in their teenage years.
When Stacy was in grade school, in 2nd or 3rd grade, she met Susie. And even though Susie didn't live real close and they all went to the same grade school, she and Janelle and Susie and several others all palled around.
So that is like a pretty, you know, clean piece of audio, which is only 20 seconds, but something you should keep in mind is that in the actual podcast, it goes on for 5 minutes. So music becomes even more important there to like heighten the mood. So I think you should be able to hear the music into this section. Oh, thanks for saying crime podcasts are the best. I agree. So this is the music that we decided to put in to make it a little more creepy.
Good at her job, but good at being a good human.
Stacy and Susie had known each other as kids, but had grown apart in their teenage years.
When Stacy was in grade school, in 2nd or 3rd grade, she met Susie. And even though Susie didn't live real close and they all went to the same grade school, she and Janelle and Susie and several others all palled around.
So there was like some creepy, like drone-y sounds in there, and then those were layered with some what I would call creepy piano. But someone just commented classroom or playground sounds, which also would be really cool. I think that would be great. So as you can hear, like in those two examples, just adding in that music, you know, really sets the mood, and also keeps people surprised and engaged.
Yeah, I was just going to say what Abby just chatted, hearing them side by side is really helpful. And you can imagine like if you had chosen something like upbeat or, you know, that mood would just have been totally different, like the same exact words.
Oh yeah. it's like a fun game that we sometimes play. Is like, if you're working on like a very like funny podcast, like a comedy podcast, if you put in somber music, it just totally, like, there's no delivery. So you can play around with it too and see like what works and what doesn't, but it is really fun. And I was just going to say something that I can't remember, but anyways, we'll come back to it if I do. So this is another editing tip that I like to tell people to do, especially if your podcast is a shorter podcast. When we speak, like I just did, we say and filler words to sort of like continue our conversation without just stopping and pausing to let the other person know that like we're interested and still speaking. But in a podcast, people get bored easily, and these filler words detract from the point. So you want to try to like cut out as much filler words as you can and try to clean up the narrative as much as possible so that you get to the point, and also it cuts down time. So in the first example, you're here, someone is kind of stumbling to get their words out.
And move to action. So much so they've decided, they've made a commitment, they're clearing 3 hours.
And then in the second version, you'll hear
and move to action. So much so they've cleared 3 hours.
So as you can see, I mean, even for me, I've heard this clip like 100 times. And in the first one, I have no idea what he's saying. Like, I'm like, what? Like, this person is just saying a bunch of words kind of thing. And in the second ones, I'm like, oh, okay, this person is moving to action and it takes 3 something. And you can even see, those are the actual waveforms. So you can see how much was cut down, and the content is like amplified, not ruined, right? So that's a good way to cut down on time too.
And Steph, is there anything else you did besides just like splice?
Like in terms of the actual audio edit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what I like to do, I usually work in Pro Tools or Logic, and what I like to do is use the scissor tool and cut the waveform, like where the waveform fades. And then I have an auto crossfade, so then I'll slide the next piece of audio over and it'll automatically crossfade the 2 sections. If you don't have the ability to do that in your DAW, like if you're working in a video editor or Audacity, what you'll want to do is put the 2 clips side by side, fade the first one out and fade the second one in, and it'll create a seamless transition. You won't even be able to hear it.
Great tip.
And another audio editing thing to do. Oh, I also want to say, if you're ever cutting audio, to try to cut at the 0 axis, so you'll know there's like a line in the middle that the waveform goes above and below. If you cut wherever it gets to the 0, that means that there's like relative silence there, so you'll be able to hear it less than cutting at other places. And yeah, I mean, we could do a whole workshop on that. That would be fun for me. And speaking of fun, plugins are a fun thing to experiment with. So in the way that I like to, use music behind different clips of narration to sort of see what kind of mood could be set, you can use plugins to make the audio that you have stand out. So 3 go-to plugins for, I think, everyone, for me at least, are an EQ, a noise gate, and a compressor. And what those do is sort of, an EQ basically like takes out parts of people's voice and adds other parts to make them sound how you want them to sound. So certain microphones will make you sound more tinny or more bassy, and with an EQ you can sort of add and remove bass to make it sound however you want. A noise gate is a gate that you put on your audio file to get rid of room noise or anything in the background. Like if you have a hum in the background, you can get rid of it usually. And then a compressor is something that makes your audio more uniform in volume, which is helpful if it's going to be broadcasted somewhere. But I like to use plugins to just experiment and see what I can do, because you can add reverb, you can make people sound like aliens, you can disguise people's voices if you're working on a crime podcast and you want them to seem mysterious or something. There's a lot of fun things that you can do. So get in there and play around. And if you have any questions, you can email me.
Great, thanks. So now we would love to take questions. Anyone can chat a question, or I think we might even, if you can raise your hand, I don't know how that works. Maybe Marcus can help, but we might be able to also kind of bring you up as a panelist if you want to make yourself seen to ask your question. So either way, but please ask questions. We want this, to address what issues you all are having with your editing your stories, or if you've heard something in a podcast you listen to and you're like, I wonder how they did that, or really any question for Steph.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be audio too. You can ask me anything. It can be about, stories that you want to pitch, or you can just tell me about the project you're working on. I'd love to hear more about them. Are plugins like effects on Adobe Premiere? Yes. Yeah, they are. So most workstations, so like Adobe Premiere or Logic or whatever you have, GarageBand, will come with a built-in set of effects or plugins. And then if you, search on the internet, you can find other ones that people have made that you can then download and add to your own like roster of tools that you're working with. And a lot of them are free or open source, so you can get them kind of from everywhere. That's a great question.
I was wondering, as we're waiting for other questions to come in, who would you want to interview, dead or alive, for a podcast?
Oh my gosh.
What would be a dream interview for you?
I have like the first person that comes to mind is Dolly Parton, and I don't know why, but I would love to just do anything with Dolly Parton. And then maybe like Beyonce, because she never does press really, so I would just want to know, what's she up to in life. Or like Drake also for that reason. And because I'm Canadian, so I feel like I have to talk about Drake at least once in this event.
We got a question we got a Q&A. What about copyright on music? And then also kind of goes along with Elise's question, where can students find free music and sounds?
Yes. Copyright on music is a super complex topic that I would just like to preface with that I'm not a lawyer. So it is pretty difficult. What I will say is if you are using like, pop music that from the radio in your podcast, that will definitely come up against infringements. There is like a library of sounds that you can use from YouTube that are good for videos on YouTube, but it's kind of unclear if they're able to be used in podcasts. So what I usually recommend doing is looking on free libraries. So there's like freesound.org, there's SFX.
Free Music Archive.
Yeah, Free Music Archive. There's a free SFX, I think .co.uk or something. I can look those up and tweet them at y'all after, but there are free libraries that you can use. And then something that I really like to do, if you want to use like more like artist run music, more like popular music, I like to just go on SoundCloud and find music by people and message them, because often it's people like you and me that are just like creating music, and very often, if you give them credit, they're very grateful to be part of something, and if it works with your piece, I'm sure they'd love to hear what you're working on too. So if you can find like a collaborative space like that where there are artists kind of working together, that's a really good thing to use.
Great idea. Yeah. And I know Student Reporting Labs, we are looking into music from Blue Dot Sessions, which you all can explore. So your youth media producer can kind of give you more information about that, of how we can add it to your story. But go ahead and like look at that site and start exploring. And there's a lot of sort of more minimally music that's good for podcasts, because it's like creates the mood, but it isn't too like, doesn't like take over from the story.
If you want to like, spend a night experimenting, creating your own music, and even without instruments, like there's a lot of things you can do with just, if you have like a waveform of your voice, just saying like, you can take that and, use these effects. So you can pitch shift it and time stretch it. And what that'll do is totally change the quality of it. If you add some reverb to it, you can end up making these like really like ambient drone sounds with any piece of source audio. It doesn't have to come from an instrument. But that's like a long process, but it could be fun.
That is fun. There's another Q&A. I think this one came in before Marie's, and then we can get to Marie's, but from Abby saying, how can we keep an important aspect of the podcast that you want to highlight running if the conversation seems to be running dry?
How can you keep an important aspect of the podcast that you want to highlight running if the conversation? So if I'm understanding correctly, like you want to keep a clip in, but it gets boring in it, or is this in the interview process? How can you keep an important aspect of the podcast to highlight running if a conversation seems to be running dry? I think if you're in the edit process and the conversation feels like it's lagging when you're listening to it, something you can do is sort of cut it up. I like to also play like kind of like a puzzle with it. So what I'll do is I'll cut whenever there's like a change in topic or a breath. So if someone is like, I have been named Steph my whole life, and then they start a new sentence like, but I moved to Montreal when I was 12 and decided maybe I don't want to be named Steph anymore. Then before but, I would cut those into different segments and highlight them in different colors, and then see if I could play around with them and if all of them are necessary, because sometimes you'll find that the narrative still stays the same without pieces being in it. So sometimes you can fully delete sections. If that's not an option, I would recommend using music. So again, where that cut was made, where there's like a break or even just like a slight shift in the conversation, if you bring in music there, swell it, and then sort of have it laying underneath the next bit, it sort of cues to the listener like, oh, this is different and exciting in a new way. And especially if you're using music that is like, has a beat to it, it will help keep people engaged.
I wonder too if like, let's say you're interviewing someone about whatever topic, OCD, and they are telling this whole long story and it's really interesting and you want to like include that story, but it's just, they maybe don't tell it very succinctly. You could kind of summarize their story in voice track. I know our, the previous guest, Vika, talked about that, how like, in order to get like a lot of information, you can really like summarize in between these like interview sound bites, so you can kind of like skip over a part, but still like include that part of the story.
And what's nice is if you can do that, you can also like include maybe 2 or 3 quotes of theirs and script around it. So maybe you'd say like, you'd have the guest say, I'm Steph, I've had OCD, or I have OCD, and then that's the clip you use, and then you script, I talked to Steph and she's had OCD, like she has OCD, and this is an experience, she told me about it. Say the experience, and then maybe end with a clip of the guest's voice again. So you're sort of like, you're summarizing the not eloquent bit, but you're still keeping their voice and like personality in so that the listener can hear that they're a different person.
Yeah, that's great. Marie asked, where was your question? About balancing natural sound. How do you balance, so how do you balance sounding natural in a podcast when you've scripted it?
That is a great question, and it's pretty difficult. There are some tips. My go-to tip, which is not like a industry standard, is to start every sentence with so. So if I have a scripted, segment that is like, I talked to Briget at 7:30 p.m. and she told me this story, I would start it, instead of starting it that way, I'd say, so I talked to Briget to me, it just like signals in my brain that I'm talking to someone. So I think try to make it as conversational as you can. So picture that you're talking to someone. I know there are like industry tips where you put like a picture of someone actually up on your computer or up on your wall and say the lines to them, because it signals something in your brain that you're talking to someone. Another great tip is to smile while you're recording, because believe it or not, you can actually hear when someone is smiling in their voice. So if you are saying something and trying to be not even happy, just general like conversational tone. Normally when you're talking to someone in person, you have a bit of like a smile to your face because you're trying to like, be in conversation with someone. So if you put that smile on, it's going to feel ridiculous while you're doing it, but you will be able to hear it and it'll sound more natural.
That's really great. I'm curious, like knowing all that you know about podcasting, like, what do you wish, like if there was just a couple things, what do you wish your younger self knew that like you would pass on to our students? Like,
I wish that I knew this was an option for me for work because I feel like it's the coolest, best job ever. And I just didn't even know that it was an option. And I think similarly, like most women are not necessarily like taught that they can have like more technical roles. So I never really saw the like engineering or sound side of things as something that was like a job for me, and it's still something that like I have to assert often. So if I could tell my younger self something, it would be to like assert yourself from the get-go because you know a lot, and just feel like empowered by the knowledge you do have, and to also feel like empowered to be creative. I think a lot of times we're scared of being creative and trying things out because we don't want to do something wrong, but making a podcast or anything is kind of an art. So there is no wrong, there's no wrong or right. There's just what ends up sounding good, and sounding good is up to you.
yeah, so true. And like to take the courage to like be courageous enough to like kind of forge your own path. Like,
Yeah.
I think more creative fields aren't necessarily as like laid out for you ahead of time. Like this is what it's going to look like versus, maybe more traditional professions.
Well,
but
and
yeah,
there were so many layers of that in my life. Like, I somehow own a company and I have a fine arts degree, like no one is like, you can own a business, and I don't think there's, in the same way that there aren't a lot of women in like recording studios, there aren't a lot of women like business owners, and there aren't a lot of like artists who are business owners, and people kind of make these rules to try to fit you in boxes. But there are no boxes. Those are all fakes. You can do whatever you want to do in life, to an extent. But I also think because we're talking to people that are making podcasts on mental health, like having any sort of mental health, any experience like dealing with a mental health disorder is also a strength, and seeing that as a strength is something that I would have liked to see before. Like owning my mental health disorder and struggles earlier would have helped me feel comfortable telling those stories and relating to other people. And I think, Cheryl said this at the beginning, that like we tell stories and use stories as a way to connect with people, and podcasts do that really well. And, I wish I had listened to more podcasts from people that were dealing with similar things to me, and that I felt comfortable, talking about those things earlier.
Yeah. I wish our podcast had been available to you as a teenager.
Same. But I do think it's so cool that you're making them, and, that other people will get to listen to them too, because everyone will be able to relate their experiences. I'll listen to them for sure. Someone asked me about my microphone. That's such a cool mic. It's an industry standard. This is a Shure SM7B. It is a very famous podcasting mic. It is very heavy, is the only thing that I would say about it. It's hard to get a desktop stand like this. Normally they come on like a big boom arm, but it is an industry standard, and I love it.
Your audio sounds very great.
Thank you.
Very clear. We just have a few more minutes. I can maybe, Marcus, go back to the slides. We have a couple more slides just to show a couple more resources, but if anyone else has questions, feel free to chat them in here. We can keep talking. I just want to point out we have a Level Up, a video tutorial on audio storytelling made with the help of Sonal Prakash, who's a senior at Dominion High School, one of our SRL labs. And we also have a one-page guide on audio storytelling. And NPR has a great site too, a training site with the link there. And Steph, I know you said there might be, or they have great resources on like music, finding the right music for your podcast too, right? On NPR.
Yeah, finding the right music, and they have a lot of good recording tips too. So I think most people have already recorded, but before you record in the future, check them out.
Great. And then we also have, I think the next slide. Oh, you guys can watch that on your own. But we also have a whole long list of mental health resources. So if you're still doing your interviews and your subject, you need to kind of direct them to get some extra help. This is a great page. We'll also be giving resources, in our actual podcast, which our student host will help talk about the resources that for all of our listeners out there, which is really important too, to leave listeners feeling supported, and that they know where to turn to if they need help. Awesome. And yeah, do you want to talk kind of about these takeaways, and also anyone too can chat to things that they have learned today, or things that they want to try for their own stories?
Yeah, so I think I just summarized what we talked about, but yeah, to choose the clips that grab you and then script around them. So I think, often we try to start with the script and then find clips to fill in, where I think it's easier to go the opposite way. So listen back to the tape that you have with the people that you've interviewed, and then pick out the best ones and script around them. Cut them down to be concise. That just makes the difference, hearing that like rambly, stumbly audio piece and then hearing the same thing that's just like 4 words, that can help you, cut down time. It can help with the interview if you're feeling like it's dragging, and it just helps the listener stay engaged. Remind people what they're listening to and why. That's good to do at the beginning of an episode, just to sort of set up what you're talking about. And it's also good to do before and after a clip that you're introducing. So if you're going to be talking to one person, who are you talking to? What's the main takeaway from that? Surprise the listener as much as possible, but minimum every 2 minutes. And there's lots of ways you can do that. You can come in, like a surprise doesn't have to be music or sound effect. It could just be, a change in who's speaking, or a pause with like the narrator coming in. Layer music and sound effects. That's fun. Play around with that and have fun with plugins, which is also fun. And I put my contact info there too. So if you want to email me, that's my direct email. And then that is my Twitter and my company's Twitter as well. So if you have any questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking today, or if you want to just, chat sometime about podcasts or tell me about your favorite one, I would love to hear about it.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And we just got another question. This one's for Cheryl. Do you have guidance around whether a personal anecdote someone shares in an interview is good for a story, in terms of destigmatizing mental illness, or instead maybe too personal and not necessary to include in your story?
That's an excellent question. I would say, just kind of like piggybacking on what Steph said about her wish that she wished she would have heard more stories that kind of way before that connected to what she was going through. I think the stories itself of what people may be going through is what can help someone else feel I'm not alone. So I think the stories can convey that message that other people go through what you may be going through. Mental health is more common than we think. 1 in 5 people in the United States could have a mental health challenge. So that stories, those kinds of stories is what illustrate that, hey, like listen to this story. This person is seeking help, or this person wants to seek help. You can too. So I think that's what personal stories convey.
Yeah, I also want to just add that I think in the same way that I was saying, we want to get more diversity in the rooms. Like it helps to destigmatize and not misrepresent mental health disorders if they're being told by the actual person going through them. So I always try, if I have a personal anecdote from someone with a mental health struggle and it's coming from their voice, I try to honor that as much as possible and not reframe it with my own voice, because it is their story to tell. And at the end of the day, even if it feeds into an unhealthy stereotype, it's their experience coming from their voice, and they're the one with the mental health disorder. which hopefully other people can relate to. Oh, I think we got another question.
Yeah, Abby says, I feel like when I move the subject's words around to tell the story better, I'm changing their words from how they intended to tell their story.
That is a line that is crossed often, to be completely honest. I think, if you're changing their words, that is fine. If you're changing their point or the message that they were trying to convey, that's when it crosses the line. I think it's fine to move around words so that, like, often I'm trying to think of an example. Like, if someone could say, it helped me feel comfortable, and I could cut off comfortable, right, and end with, it helped me feel. And that's not changing the tone. I mean, it could be if you have like creepy music or something, right? But as long as you're not changing the actual message that the person's saying, I don't think it's bad. But if you are changing the messaging, that's when it gets into kind of like sketchy territory. But I can relate to that, and I often also feel like that. But it's usually like, for example, I have to send all of the things that I do with like celebrities or interviews back to their team to get approval on. And I would say in 80% of the podcasts that I work on, there are moments where I'm like, oh, I'm cutting out this word or I'm changing this sentence around. And I send it to them, and then it's always approved because the message is the same. Like, people don't usually remember the exact words that they say, but they remember the message that they were trying to convey. So as long as you're conveying the right message, it's fine.
So I know we're at time. So if anyone does need to go, I just want to like thank you, Steph. Thank you, Cheryl, for being here, sharing your wisdom. Thank all of you who joined. And if anyone does have any questions, we can keep going, but I just want to, note that we are at time. And so I know everyone's got busy lives. So if you do need to go, feel free. But if you do have another question, we can stay on for another minute or so. This has been super helpful, and I'm so glad that we have the recording of it so that we can make it a resource for the rest of our network too.
Fun. Yeah, this was so fun. Thank you for having me here. And thanks to everyone who came in their night after I'm sure you've been on other video calls today. So, and yeah, again, my email is always open, and so is my Twitter if anyone wants to chat about things.
Great, excellent. Well, it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in, so we can just end it here. But thank you again, Steph. Thanks again, Cheryl. Marcus, thanks for doing the slides. And
Marcus, thank you.
Has a great night.
Thanks so much. Have a great night, everyone.
All right, thanks. Bye.